All right, so a good question is, what about the supply of labor? Understanding the market for labor helps us understand wages, which helps us understand a lot of other things like inequality. So what about the supply side of the labor market? How much do we choose to work at different wages? Why do we work in the first place? And why do we ever stop working? You can think of the work decision as really a choice between two different things. Work, which affords us money to buy things, so work equals consumption. But we don't necessarily love work in and of itself. We love it for the consumption, although we do find pleasure in work, hopefully. But the opportunity cost, or that which we give up, is leisure. So every time we choose to work an hour, we are choosing to give up an hour of leisure or unpaid work or something outside of the for-pay work realm. So we're deciding about time allocation. So we assume now that leisure is time available for purposes other than earning money to buy marketed goods. So it's not necessarily laying on the couch or in a hammock, but it could be volunteer work, anything that's not paid work, right? Could be taking care of your children. So we're looking for the individual labor supply curve. So how do we respond when the price of our labor, which is the wage, changes? Since we'll assume that leisure and the consumption that we are afforded when we work and earn an income are both normal and not inferior goods, then we like them both, frankly. And we're going to have to choose between the two. So one of the ways that we choose between any two goods, hamburgers and hot dogs, peaches, nectarines, is the relative price. So we care about the relative price of leisure versus the relative price of consumption, if you can think about it that way. Every time the wage rate changes, the price of our labor and therefore the cost of our leisure changes, because what's happening is we're giving up more every time we choose not to work. So two distinct things happen. When the wage rises, there's a substitution effect at work. The opportunity cost, that which we give up, of leisure rises. So when we decide to not work for an hour, we're giving up more as the wage has risen. This draws us to work more, since what's basically happened is the relative cost of leisure has risen. But on the other side, the income effect is also part of the situation. So a higher wage rate raises our income, our purchasing power has risen, we can afford to buy more of all the things that we like. Remember, leisure is something that we like. So this pulls us in the opposite direction and encourages us to take more time off because we can afford it. We can keep maintaining our standard of living. We can actually afford more leisure than before when the wage rate rises. So at the end of the day, which force is stronger? It depends on your relative income. It depends on your relative preferences, etc. So we can begin to generalize and say that for a person whose substitution effect dominates, or perhaps at the range of wages where your substitution effect dominates, what it would look like is as the wage rate rises, you get an increase in the number of hours worked, right? You're substituting work, which increases your consumption ability. You're doing more of that and less leisure because leisure has gotten more expensive. You're substituting the relatively cheaper good for the relatively now more newly expensive good, which is leisure. Just like if the price of nectarines went up, you'd buy more peaches, right? Price of leisure went up, so you're doing more work, which is consumption. If the income effect were to dominate, it would be backward spending. You'd have a situation where as wage rate goes up, you work fewer hours. So this is a person or perhaps a set of wages for you where you are deciding to take that extra income and instead of using it for consumption, you're going to buy yourself some leisure. So here's a quick check-in question for you. When an individual's labor supply curve is backward bending, that is downward sloping, this implies that the individual's income effect is what? A, stronger than the individual substitution effect, or B, weaker than the individual substitution effect? The answer is A. The income effect is stronger and a backwards bending curve. All right, so here's another way to logic through this. The income effect of a wage change in general is when wages increase, which is the example I've been giving, but you could move in the opposite direction as well. Wages decrease. So wages increase or decrease, we feel wealthier, poorer, and so can and will buy more or less leisure, and therefore a negative relationship between wages and hours of labor supplied. So if wages, the substitution effect of a wage change is if wages increase or decrease, the price of leisure increases or decreases compared to working and will substitute toward the cheaper good, more or less, working and less or more, leisure, therefore a positive relationship between wage and hours of labor supplied. Here's another check-in question. Some people that argue increasing taxes on the rich will cause people to stop working. What is the built-in invisible assumption in that argument? I'll give you a minute to think about it. And the answer is labor supply curves are upward sloping. And that's the logic of the labor supply curve.